Our final speaker today is Reverend David Wiggs. David has been the senior minister at Boston Avenue Methodist Church since June 2013, but he also worked at Boston Avenue from 1987 to 2000. So he has a long-time track record of the great reconciling and interfaith work done in Tulsa in the earlier days. A graduate of the University of Oklahoma, he holds a Master of Theology degree from Saint Paul. Wait a minute. Yeah, that's right. I was thinking to myself, I have an MDiv, and I thought Master of Theology. It's a Master of Divinity, but it is. Do they call it differently there? No. Okay, I'm sorry. See, he'll talk with me about this afterwards. I know. From Saint Paul Theological Seminary in Kansas City, would you please welcome my pastor, David Wiggs?
So I guess I have an hour?
Yeah.
We're going to take a break and do a little Q&A. Okay. I'll keep mine short then, as you have asked. Representing United Methodism, but also the Christian tradition in general, we have a background in our sacred text of engaging with people from different places. So we have stories about the early Christians in academic circles. We'd call these Jewish Christians, people who were grounded in Judaism before they decided that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah and they were going to follow him. And so they reached out. So we have stories about a conversion for an Ethiopian eunuch or a Samaritan or a Roman soldier or other Gentiles, those outside the group. And those have traditionally been read as only conversion stories and used by Christians as conversion stories, that we are to go and convert others. And certainly there is a strong emphasis in Christianity, in most parts of Christianity, particularly in the South of the United States, of doing that very thing. But I think we can also use those same stories as stories of inclusion. But there would be other United Methodist leaders that would disagree with me and say, no, those are only stories of conversion. I would argue that those are also stories of inclusion and looking for God as creator of us all, and God desiring diversity, or would not have created it so. And so there's other theological conclusions that we can draw from those texts. The great commandment for us is love of God and love of neighbor. And when Jesus responds to who is my neighbor, it ends up being basically anybody you run into or anybody in need. So there's a theological or religious basis for us to be engaged in this kind of experience and other kinds of interfaith work that we do around the community. As United Methodist, though, which is basically has been a denomination that grew up with our nation. We were started, our roots are actually in England, but we became a separate denomination in America. You can think about the Revolutionary War and why maybe it wouldn't work very well after the Revolution for Methodists to be wanting to report to someone in England. And so Methodism is largely an American denomination. We are structured like our federal government got structured with balance of powers and different roles assigned to different branches of our administrative groups. We started with both Anglos and African Americans in the denomination. It was an integrated group when we began, but it wasn't very long before African Americans felt disenfranchised enough that they felt compelled to start separate Methodist denominations for African Americans. So we have a number of those that are branches that became independent denominations, even though we have common roots in terms of theology and beginnings. Even in the last couple of centuries within Methodism or United Methodism, those of different races have been segregated sometimes by the way we've organized ourselves. So we don't really have a stellar history around all this. Methodism, the main branch of Methodism, divided over slavery in 1844, did not reconcile as a denomination, come back together for nearly 100 years till 1939. So it took a long time. We have not been great at this. And I would say, unfortunately, we're still not really very good at this. When you look at our churches, they look actually a lot like this room, maybe a little less diverse in terms of ethnicity, but we're largely a white denomination. It's true in the U.S., it's true in Oklahoma. We've become a worldwide denomination, and so if you look at our demographics globally, we look very different. But in the United States, our experience is that we have few African Americans, few Native Americans, few ethnic groups of others involved. We have a unique experiences in Oklahoma in that we have a group, the Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference, because of the Trail of Tears and Native Americans being in Oklahoma. Actually, the first Methodist in Oklahoma were Native Americans who came on the Trail of Tears. But as whites became the majority population, the Native peoples were sort of swept aside. And so we organized it on their behalf. They organized with some support to maintain some Native culture and Native language. So we have some 90 plus Native American churches that many function around tribal identity. So there might be a congregation of Kiowas or Cherokees or Creeks that will still worship in their native language, at least part of the worship time. So, and yet we're not really an integrated, we share a bishop, but we don't share a lot of other things. We're actually in a quadrennium right now, a 4-year period as United Methodist, doing acts of repentance around those kind of relationships. So we know we have some work to do around all of that. When we look at our own membership as United Methodist, we count just over 7 million members in the United States. 90% of those would be Anglos or whites. And Jan just told us Tulsa is 56% white. In Oklahoma, United Methodism is 94% white. So we've not done really great at welcoming or integrating and doing that kind of thing. But we do not despair. We know that God wants us to do better, and we work toward that. We're looking at any number of ways as a denomination and as Christians to be more welcoming, to be better neighbors, to work together better. I could go into some statistics, sort of like Jan shared with us. We recognize the shifting demographics. I was in a session just this week where we were leaders in Oklahoma or United Methodist looking at the growth of the Hispanic population and a dramatic growth that it's going to be. And learn some things that we don't see in the media. If you only watch the media, you would think that if you see anybody that looks Hispanic, they must be an illegal immigrant in Oklahoma. The statistic they gave us was very close to what Jan put on the slide, which was 67% of Hispanics in Oklahoma are native born. They were born either in the U.S. or in Oklahoma. There's a real shift between first generation and second generation and third generation Hispanics. And the young man who was teaching us a lot about this said, you know, the whole Hispanic word is made up by you all in the U.S. That's not a word we use. That's a word you all use to label us and sort of gloss over these differences. And he put up a slide of about 25 different faces. And he said, who are those people? Well, they looked Hispanic to us. And he said, well, let me tell you, that one's from Mexico. That one's from Cuba. That one's from Puerto Rico. That one's from Guatemala. And went through the list to help us as Anglos, and we were a largely Anglo audience listening to him, that we don't look very carefully at ethnic minority groups. That we're not very careful. We sort of say Native Americans and don't recognize all the different tribal identities, even in Oklahoma. We say Hispanic and don't look very closely at where people are really from or who they might really be. So I think we have some work to do as a majority group in particular to not only say that we are open, but in fact we have a desire to know people different than we are, if we have that desire. You know, not everybody really has that desire. Bill shared a story about one who doesn't really have that desire in my own congregation. So we're still largely a monocultural people, I think. Methodists, I would say, are living in an increasingly multicultural context. So we've really, I think, got some work to do more than just indicate, oh, I'm open to having a Jewish person or Islamic person live in my community. But if we're the majority group, we have to, I think, demonstrate what would it mean if we really thought that life together was a richer experience. So I think we can all think about our own lives individually first. What are some specific steps we could take? Sandra mentioned some of these. We could eat together, and Boston Avenue has a program to try to eat with people from other faith groups, just to have conversation, to learn about some customs, some culture, some foods, any number of things about other people's background. We do also participate in the youth trialogue that OCCJ sponsors, those kind of things. But we could do that as individuals. Our neighbors might be from a different culture, might be from a different religion, and we could invite them over to dinner. We don't have to have a group like this organize it for us to sit down and have a snack together and to have a bit of conversation about how we live and what's important and what we value and what is important to us in terms of our community and that kind of thing. So we could do that. We could study and work together. For a lot of us, only in our work context are we forced to be in contact with people from other religions and other cultures. We're pretty good at sticking with our own groups. But since I've been at Boston Avenue, as Bill said, back as a senior pastor, 18 months, we've hired an African American on staff. We've hired a Hispanic American, a Mexican American, to be specific, to be on our staff, because I think we've got to model some diversity if we really believe in it. We have to put some people in leadership that look different than I do if I'm going to stand up and affirm that we really believe that God's the creator of us all, and different people bring different gifts, and they would enrich our community if we would involve them. So we can take those kind of steps. We can participate in OCCJ, and there are many activities, of course. We're trying a new program called Systema Tulsa, which is reaching out primarily through our public schools to ethnic minority children, and inviting them to be a part of a classical orchestra experience. We can fund it and give them an opportunity to have an experience that's multicultural, but is rooted in the great music of the human culture, if you will. And so we're taking some steps like that to try to step across some perceived barriers, to engage people in different experiences together. But I think it's really on us as the majority group to initiate these kind of things, to reach out to other groups. To say we're open is one thing, but to initiate experiences that really say we value your culture, we want to participate, we want to listen, we want to learn, we want to understand, we want to recognize those differences between us and among us. We want to recognize the complexities and know what it's like not to always be in the majority group. I think that's on us, as if you're Anglo and Protestant or Christian. I think that's on us to say, what should we be doing to make Tulsa a more livable city? How could we look out for other minority groups, whether religiously or racially or otherwise, and say, how could I be an advocate so this is a safe and wonderful place for them to live as well? And we've got to do that in an ongoing way. I think if we do that, then we can move from the unknown and the fearful to the known and the loved, and we'll have better communication and better understanding. I think we'll have better lives, and we'll have a better Tulsa. I don't know about you, but most of the time I spend my life in places where I am the majority group, where males are in charge and white people are in charge and people with money are in charge and Christians are in charge. But I had an opportunity. I was invited by a friend to attend his wedding. He happened to be a young African-American man. I assumed because he invited me that there would be a variety of racial groups there. But I was wrong. I walked in and I was one of 2 white people at this wedding. And you know what? I felt really strange. And I felt like everybody was looking at me and wondering, why in the world is that white guy here? And what's he going to do next? It was a great experience for me to be in that setting where the tables were turned so very differently than how most of my life is. We probably need more of those kinds of experiences. Most of us avoid them, but there are some that we could seek out. So I think that's the first thing, is not that our organizations can't do this kind of thing, which is important, but for each of us to look at our own lives and say, is there a specific step I could take to step over one of these barriers to create a different kind of communication or experience or relationship? If all of us, I don't know how many are in here, several hundred of us did that, that would make for a different Tulsa. I'd hope we would decide to try that. Thank you.